As we begin here, I would like to declare a swift and decisive victory in the Great Brick War for all Gomer kind. Not a single brick was burned out upon throughout the entire weekend, and no, internet contrarians, mostly on Twitter, you do not count a lockup on the bricks. That was not done with any malicious intent to harm our great and prosperous 109 or whatever it is year-old bricks. So I would like to declare victory in the brick war, and hopefully there will be yet another meme that we can move on to and I'll argue pointlessly about. So let's talk about the 2019 Brickyard 400. So it wasn't a good race. I don't think you're surprised that I'm saying that, and if you are, I hope you enjoyed your vodka. Hopefully it was Big Machine vodka. But, yeah, I mean, but what did you really expect? There's two factors that really made this race quite hard to watch, if you're just in it for the entertainment value. First of all, I think Kevin Harvick deserves a ton of credit, him and his Stewart-Haas racing team. I think regardless of the package they used today, I think Kevin Harvick would have been untouchable. It just was his day. I think he led over 100 laps. And that hasn't been done a whole lot, especially in recent NASCAR with the stage racing and some of the strategy options that gives other teams to get up front, at least temporarily, even if they don't have the dominant car. In this case, Kevin Harvick just completely owned this race. So from that perspective, I think Kevin Harvick is a deserving winner, a deserving champion of this race. But, you know, if you're looking at it from an entertainment standpoint, and a lead changes standpoint, I know I usually don't judge races based on lead changes, but this race had one competitive one, and it was on a restart. And for a package that everybody claims is this, you know, the next greatest thing to slice bread, or at least some of the apologists do, it was no. And you know, it wasn't even the worst Brickyard 400. I think 2017 is still the worst one. But it was not good by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't even last year's race. And that's not saying much, because at least last year's race you had that battle at the end that was brought on by the green-white checker with the meaningless guys in the back running into each other. I mean, just for this new high downforce, high drag, low horsepower package, Indianapolis is the exact perfect track to expose all of the flaws of it. Dirty air was a huge factor throughout the weekend, both in the Cup race and the Xfinity race. You know, even if you'd see a guy get a huge lead, they'd often lose the lead because they would get into lap traffic, and even though they'd pass them relatively easily, you could just tell that it would slow them down. I mean, you could see the gaps. I mean, it would just go down dramatically as soon as the leaders got into lap traffic. A lot of times when faster cars would get behind other cars, you know, and they didn't pass them in the first lap and a half on that restart, and really the first two corners, turns 1 and 2, getting on the backstretch. If you didn't complete a pass by then, chances are you were not going to pass virtually anybody the whole rest of the tire stint. And so, you know, with Indianapolis being a flat track, with Indianapolis generally being a one-groove track, but at the same time, it's a 2.5-mile super speedway. So this was completely the wrong package to bring to Indianapolis, and I know it's essentially a standardized package outside of a couple of the short tracks where they use 750 horsepower. Boy, oh boy. I mean, you know, I attended the 2014 Brickyard 400. That wasn't a race that necessarily stood you on your ear, but at the same time, I would have taken the 2014 Brickyard 100 times out of 100 over this. You know, I think for an Indianapolis track, for the way Indianapolis is set up, I think you really need to go with higher horsepower, less downforce, especially for stock cars, because essentially what they've created with this package is a slower IndyCar race with more turbulence. So, you know, it's not great, because I know a lot of people complained about the lack of passing in the Indy 500. The Indy 500 looked like, you know, 2000 Winston 500 compared to this race from that perspective. The restarts were really where time was either gained or lost, and that's also where we saw the accidents, and boy, there were some accidents. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And so many of those accidents caused so much yellow. I mean, this race just felt like, this was the opening weekend of NFL football, and I am the hardest core of hardcore racing fans. And I had a hard time not switching to the NFL during this race. I mean, it's just like, especially at the end of that second stage. And I know I'm not going to beat the dead horse about stage cautions, but, there was a piece of debris in turn 2, and it was like a 5 or 6 lap caution. And, it's just like, why am I watching this right now? At the very least, I will take a boring race under green than a boring race under yellow. And this race didn't really provide that. So that was disappointing, just how much downtime was in this race. Boy, if you're going to have a bad race, at least try to make it expedient, as quick as you can make it. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. But I complained about that about IndyCar too last weekend, so don't think I'm bashing NASCAR just because. I think that's a problem across all motorsports, or at least American motorsport at this point. So I mentioned restart crashes, and definitely the one that got people talking the most was the accident between Eric Jones and Brad Keselowski, which saw Brad Keselowski spin into an inside wall, which was protected by a tire barrier. Car got up on its side, but Brad climbed out under his own power and walked away totally fine, checked and released from the care center. But Brad had some concerns about the accident. He said, he didn't like the angle of the wall. It was unsafe. And so, I think a lot of people are going to expect me to light Brad up here. I'm not going to. I think, I do take what he said in the heat of the moment, just coming out of the care center, with a grain of salt, especially the harshness of it. Because of the fact that, hey, this is a guy who is the defending winner of this race, got taken out in an accident. He's probably not totally cooled down yet when you're sticking a mic in his face. But at the same time, I'm not going to say his concern is illegitimate. Certainly, you don't want those kind of jutting angles out in any kind of an oval race. I will say this, though. If that was a truly dangerous situation for Brad Keselowski, he wouldn't have walked away from it. Because obviously that tire wall, while it's weird to have a tire wall on an oval track, it did its job. It stopped him. It did not cause any huge damage. And the key here, and I think one of the reasons there isn't a safer barrier down there, is because it did not, that was going to be a big impact no matter what you're hitting. If he had hit a safer barrier, there is a possibility that it would have launched him back onto the track, and then you see what we saw at Spa last weekend, where you get some possibility for T-boning. So I disagreed with the claim that it was totally unsafe or any kind of an insinuation that IMS had not thought about this. Hell, Felix Rosenqvist hit that wall in practice for the Indy 500. So they're aware of it. Is there going to be a change? I think if there's a big enough concern, I think Brad should be heard out, and he has been. They should make that change. What that change is, I have no idea. But at the same time, I hope whatever change they make doesn't have any unintended consequences. So I guess we'll talk about the playoffs, because this was a big talking point throughout the entire weekend. And the driver that was really the big part of this discussion was Jimmie Johnson. Never missed a postseason in NASCAR in his career, and he was going into this race on the outside looking in. And it all fell apart for Jimmie when he got in a little bit of a scuffle with William Byron, spun out, took a bunch of cars with him, and thus any chance of a title in 2019 went out the window. So I agree that was a big story going in, because Jimmie Johnson is a 6-time champion of the Cup Series. Or 7-time champion of the Cup Series, sorry. So he has so many championships, sometimes I forget. He's a big deal. And his participation in NASCAR's postseason is a big deal. And the fact that he was not involved in this conversation at all kind of speaks to the year that he has had, which has been a bad one. I understand the coverage of that. What I don't understand is the constant talk about playoffs, especially when it was getting down to the end of the race. And you've got storylines like Bubba Wallace running third. There was a battle for fourth that went completely ignored between William Byron and Ryan Blaney. It was completely ignored on the broadcast. And by the way, Bubba Wallace's third place didn't even get an interview until I think it was like an hour and a half or an hour later after the checkered flag. I understand this isn't Formula One, but that's a guy who got a third place at Indianapolis. Regardless of whether it's a NASCAR race or not, you should interview the guy. I mean, that was a hell of a performance from Bubba Wallace, and he didn't get any of the recognition that he deserved. And instead of focusing on some of these stories that were playing out throughout the race and maybe would have made the race a bit more engaging, you're focusing on the battle for whatever it was, 13th, 14th, 15th with Suarez and Newman. And I'll be honest with you, does anyone outside of the fan bases of Suarez and Newman, which I don't think there's a huge demand for Suarez and Newman stuff, like what are we looking at here? Because even if they make whichever of those drivers makes the playoffs, does anyone truly believe that they're actually going to have an opportunity to win the championship? You know, it's like, okay, like I can see through this as a viewer. And, you know, it almost belittles the event, whatever event, regardless of whether it's in Indianapolis or not. And, you know, it's going to be at Daytona next year. You know, are they going to be talking about playoffs the whole time? Are they going to have a plate race where, you know, you're going to have a pack of 25 cars and there's going to be a hell of a battle for the lead or maybe second place, and they're going to be showing 13th, 14th, 15th in the pack to figure out who's going to lead the points, or not even lead the points, get 12th in the points and head into the first three races? I mean, it's like, okay, you're extending their, you know, fantasy of a championship 4 weeks. It's just like this stuff is not justified in the amount of coverage that it gets. I understand if this was for a championship in Indianapolis. It's not for a championship. It's for, you know, the battle for the scraps in the championship and to be eliminated in the first round of the playoffs. It's grasping at straws. And I think it hurts the event as a whole, especially like the Brickyard or next year at Daytona. It's going to hurt that event to have all this talk about the playoffs rather than the talk about, you know, who's going to win the race or how is the race going to play out. Again, I'm a race fan. I'm not a playoff fan. And maybe there are some people who really get into the playoffs in NASCAR. But when I tune into a race, I want to watch the race and I want to watch coverage of the race. I don't mind if you mention championship. I understand. You know, it's a big part of it. But, you know, when there's a battle for fourth in the last couple of laps and passing has been at a premium and you're showing cars running single file, to me that's a problem and very disappointing. But speaking of, I'm going to give them some TV time, or at least some YouTube time, because I do want to give a shout out again to Bubba Wallace, man. He made the last like 20 laps of that race enjoyable for me to watch. I was really... You know, I'm a Bubba Wallace fan. I do enjoy watching him race, and, you know, he's been in a bad situation at Petty Enterprises. And I would definitely say that they got lucky with this weekend being the way it was, that the passing was at such a premium. But he did make some passes on the restart, and he held his own against cars that are way stronger than his. You know, obviously, once the field strung out, it was going to be very hard to pass him. But on those restarts, he did a great job. And that is a well-earned third place for Bubba Wallace at a track that is very difficult and very different than that second place he got at Daytona. I think there's a lot more skill required to get to third place at Indianapolis than there is to get to it at Daytona, because I think there's a lot more luck involved at Daytona. I don't think Bubba Wallace necessarily had a very lucky race at Indianapolis. He had a skillful race, and I think that deserves a lot of praise. So, no burnout on the bricks this year. Give them a thumbs up to the guys at NASCAR, even though Kevin Harvick did a perfectly nice burnout, even on the front straightaway. No problem. I'm good. And then NASCAR moves on to its nearly 3-month-long playoff. See you in like 11 months at Homestead or whatever. I hope you've enjoyed the Brickyard coverage this year. If you did, be sure to subscribe, leave a like on the video. This has been David Land on YouTube, and I will see you in the next video.